Good evening. Good to see everybody. Tonight we're in our 22nd lesson on the study that goes from the Kings to the King. And we're getting closer all the time to the time and appearance of Jesus. And so we had looked at the history of God's people as they had gone to Babylonian captivity and the last bit of history before that. The time of captivity, then the period of restoration, and now we're studying the intertestament period, and we're using as our study guide and outline for the study of the intertestament period between the Old and New Covenants, between the Old and New Testaments. We're using the prophecies of Daniel, because as we have spoken of before, God is silent during this period. There's no revelation that is recorded and preserved for us from the time of Malachi to the stories of the Gospels that tell of the immediate prophecies of the birth of John, the birth of Jesus, and the birth of those two in about the year 0, round number, of our calendar. So there's this 350-year period, again, round number, because we're not exactly sure when Malachi's prophecies were, but generally dated around the year 370 to 350 BC before Christ, that God is silent for that long period of time. But God was not silent about that long period of time, and he told Daniel the things that were going to come. And so we've kind of stepped back to the end of the captivity, even though we had another 70 or 80 years of history revealed in the Old Testament after the time of Daniel. But Daniel's prophecies uniquely look forward into the times, really starting with, this prophecy in here in Daniel 11 had some of the things of the Persian Empire, but mostly it's about the time of the Greek Empire. And so from the time we end the Old Testament, where the Jews are speaking Aramaic, and they're in they are part of the Persian Empire, and then we open up the New Testament, and the Jews are speaking Greek, and they're part of the Roman Empire. And if we don't know this history, go, what just happened? Well, what happened is the things that Daniel prophesied and tells us about. And so we're on page 90 of the study guide at lesson 22. Lesson 22, page 90. And we're going to be in the section that is called Future History of the Greeks. And so it is a future history because Daniel sees these coming kingdoms. And what we can learn from that is that God certainly knew, and we conclude controlled, what the saints would be facing for generations to come. And so God definitely foresees and through Daniel foretells. And from that we certainly gather that there is some control by God of those events. And not just that he happened to know what would happen, but there's a guiding hand behind it all to work out well for his people. There's the struggles of the Jews. There's the victories they have. So there'll be both victories and struggles. And there's interactions with world powers. And these are described. So we start in the Persian Empire. And we know them from history. If we know anything about the Greeks, and most famously in the last couple of years, there's been entered into popular culture through movies and graphic novels and like the 300, those guys at Thermopylae. Well, that king and that battle was foretold in the scripture, not the exact details of it, but the fact that would occur, that the Persians would go attack the Greeks, then the Greeks would go and conquer all the Persians, and the people of that story, some of them are actually literally Bible characters as a result. And then the Greek domination, the Greek really suppression and mistreatment of the Jewish people, their survival of that and prosperity to come, and then also describe the coming of the Romans. All this is in this long prophecy of Daniel 11. And if you have your Bible open, that's what we're going to be reading later. And not too much later, but a little bit. You'll see how long a chapter Daniel 11 is, and it is basically the history that is to come. And so that's how we'll talk about this intertestament period. And the ultimate end, it will see, is the victory of God's Messiah. And so God sent the Messiah. I have my apostrophe there in the wrong place. That's a singular possessive, God's Messiah, not a plural possessive, God's Messiah. But anyway, I'll correct that for the video. Nobody told me I had that wrong last week, so I blame y'all. Okay, so we started in chapter 10, the terrifying man, the one is very much like the glorified Christ of Revelation 1, who comes and gives Daniel the prophecy of things to come. We have the timeline, which you have in your book, and we spent enough time on that last week. Here are the main things that the prophecy will tell us about. And we recall that one of the great concerns is for the city of Jerusalem and for the temple. And so the people of God, the place where God's name was, God's holy city. So who controls that is a major historical thing and also a major part of this prophecy. And we'll note that Alexander the Great comes and he takes Jerusalem without, he didn't have to take it in anger. They opened the gates and said, welcome. We read about you right here in our book. And Josephus says that Alexander says, that's funny. I dreamed that you guys dressed exactly like this would welcome me like this to this city. And they said, hey, that's great. And so come on in. And so Alexander's conquering of Tyre and Sidon is a thing of historic, great things, historic stories, building the causeway to go get the people there at Tyre, and the causeway that still exists. Then going and conquering Egypt very, very quickly. So these things are well known in history. And so Alexander takes over after his death, which was right after he conquered everything. His general Ptolemy, the rulers from Egypt, those rulers controlled Jerusalem more or less for 100 years. There were times when they briefly lost control, fighting with those family of the general who took over in Damascus. That would be the family of the Seleucids. As we made note, the most famous name with the Seleucids is Antiochus, the father of Seleucus. So we run in the New Testament to cities like named Antioch all over the place. Then we have the Maccabean Revolt, and that's, again, well-known history, and the story of Hanukkah, and all of that comes from that period of time. Judas Maccabee, Judas the Hammer, the horrible ruler who provoked the revolt, Antiochus IV. Then the brief rule, I say brief, it's 100 years. The 100-year rules of the Jews of their own kingdom, where this priestly family who was related closely to the Maccabees, known as the Hasmoneans, they have a kingdom in Jerusalem. So we have a Jewish priestly family as king in Jerusalem for 100 years. And then the Romans take over. And it's not long after that the story of the gospel begins. So these are the people who are in charge of Jerusalem. That will be in our prophecy. So let's look at this prophecy in Daniel 11. We're going to start with the Persian rule. We're going to have a couple of generations of Persians. Then we're going to have this long section about the Greeks. And then there seems to be a switch of kings after the horrible king, which I believe is a prophecy even of Herod, and even of the time after Herod, all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. And I believe Jesus refers to this prophecy when he says, this is the abomination of desolations, let the reader understand, as is written by the prophet Daniel. Jesus is saying in Matthew 24. And then after that, there is a little section, it's in chapter 12, but it's the same prophecy of the persecution of the saints, but of their rescue and the triumph of their Messiah. So we have 45-ish verses of future history coming. So verses 3 and 4. We're in Daniel 11, 3 and 4. So it says, then the warrior king will arise. So that's right after that king of Persia stirred up everybody against Greece. Then a warrior king will arise, and he will rule a vast realm, and he will do whatever he wants. So it pretty much describes Alexander. But as soon as he is established, his kingdom will be broken up and divided to the four winds of heaven, but not to his descendants. It will not be the same kingdom that he ruled, because his kingdom will be uprooted and go to others. So that is the reference to Alexander, the king with great power, who's a warrior, who does what he wants. but then the division into 4, and none of his descendants will have this throne. So normally, who gets to be the king? The son of the king, or the nephew of the king, or, you think about we mostly know the English royal family. Do they know out to 35, 40, 50 people who is the next one in line? And what's the most important thing if you want to be in the royal line of succession? Who your ancestors were, right? How much would it take for me or you or anybody you know to get into the royal line of succession? Well, wouldn't happen, right? But what if you were a duke or a nobleman? That still wouldn't happen. And so normally the king goes, the kingdom goes to the relatives. But in this case, the kingdom will not go to any relatives. And the reason for that largely was, I don't recall any mention in history of Alexander having brothers. I don't know if he had any or not. But Alexander did have multiple wives. And I think he had 4 of them. And he had several children. Of course, he died at a young age. So what happens when a man in his 30s dies? How old are his kids? They're not old enough to rule. And so various of his wives tried to get their children to inherit the kingdom of their father Alexander, and none of them got it. And it took them a few years to get around to having a civil war. After Alexander died, it took them about 5 to 8 years to get around to having a civil war. But by the time they finally did get around to it, they just basically killed everybody who was related to him. So all of his wives, all of their children, they all got killed in the infighting, including his mother. His mother got involved in it. She was still young enough and energetic enough to put in a claim to rule. And so she ended up getting killed as well. All right, so that's what the prophecy says about that. Then we move on to verse 5, and we start with this history of the king of the south, and we're going to have a king of the north. And so the king of the south will grow powerful, but one of his commanders will grow more powerful and will rule a kingdom greater than his. And after some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. So the daughter from the south to the king of the north, but she will not retain power, and his strength will not endure. She will be given up, together with her entourage, her father, and the one who supported during those times. All right? That turns out to be a pretty detailed prophecy. And if you'll notice in the notes on page 90 toward the bottom, we'll see these 2 of those 4 kingdoms that the Greeks established after Alexander. There were 4 kingdoms, and there were 2 that become important for us. The one that is called the north and the south, and that's from the perspective of Jerusalem. The south is the Ptolemies down in Egypt. The north is the Seleucids up in Damascus. And here's what happened in this detailed prophecy, that Ptolemy II sent his daughter to marry a fellow named Lysimanus, and they were going to make a political dynasty. And then, though, there got to be a war. There had been war between their dynasties. And so this marriage was to put an end to those wars and unite them. But when she went up there to marry him, he was already married. And so he put away his wife to marry her. But then her father died, and the guy got rid of the wife from Egypt, and he went back to his first wife, and he got rid of her, the one from Egypt and her children. He went back to his first wife, got rid of the second one. And then, though, the first wife after this, she didn't trust him so much. And so she had him poisoned. And she also killed the children. She killed the lady who came up from Egypt. She killed her, and she also killed all of her children. And then everybody who was involved in any of this died without getting to rule. And so, again, in world history, when the family of the rulers of Egypt and the family of the rulers of Damascus have this kind of little spat, we go, okay, so what? But again, you just look at what Daniel had said, and Daniel had spoken about this 200 years in the future. It says, for some years they will form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. She'll not retain power. His strength will not endure. She'll be given up together with her entourage, her father, and the one who supported her during those times. Okay. That's a better summary, I'm pretty sure, than I just gave. And Daniel gave it 200 years before it happened. The point of this is not all of these details of these people. That's really not the point of it. The point of it is what? God knows what's going to happen. God knows what is going to happen. And so, I don't know, what if somebody today, let's just pick a strange scenario going forward from our own political circumstance. Let's just say, let's pretend for a second that Joe Biden, in order to secure the presidency in the next election, he divorces his wife and he marries Trump's wife, because that way it would unite the two parties. We were just going with something totally outlandish here. He divorces his wife and he marries Trump's wife, and then after he gets elected, he puts Trump's wife away and he goes back and remarries his wife, but his wife now hates him so much for this that she poisons the both of them, and then nobody gets to be in charge, and I don't know, maybe they impeach them all and Nancy Pelosi gets to be in charge. Okay, could you predict that kind of weird thing go from now? I mean, no, nobody would see that coming, right? But what if somebody saw something that bizarre, and this is the level of bizarreness of the history of these people. What if somebody saw something that ridiculously bizarre 200 years in advance? What would you say? I need to get some lotto numbers from that guy. Is that what you'd say? You'd say, that man knew something. Who told him that? Well, it's that kind of thing. And it's not just in this event, but it's just thing after thing after thing as we go forward. All right, so let's move on. Verse 7. In the place of the king of the south, one of her family will rise up, will come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He will take action against them and triumph. All right, so then after the sister is mistreated, the brother, who is the ruler down in Egypt, he actually went up there and he invaded the territory of the people up in Damascus, and he had great success going up there, vindicating his sister and taking his revenge. He will even take, verse 8, he will take even their gods captive to Egypt with their metal images and their precious articles of silver and gold. For some years he will stay away from the king of the north, who will enter the kingdom of the south and then return to his own land. And so he went up there, he looted them, he looted the capital, he carried off their idols, and then they, to respond to that, they went down to invade Egypt, and they did that for a while, and they were able to rule Egypt for a while, and they took a great heavy tribute, history tells us. All right, so again, I can see how excited you are about this history of the kingdom of Damascus and the kingdom, this it's called Egypt, but really it's led by these Greeks. I can tell how greatly excited you are about this. But the thing is, God saw it coming. And God said this was going to come. And really these details, I think for our purposes, are important pretty much for that, right? That's why these details of history are important. So then his sons, so we're multiple generations now into this conflict. His sons will mobilize for war and assemble a large number of armed forces. They will advance, sweeping through like a flood, and they will again wage war as far as his fortress. Infuriated, because now we got a foreign army in the south, infuriated, the king of the south will march into the fight with the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but they will be handed over to his enemy. When the army is carried off, he will become arrogant and cause tens of thousands to fall, but he will not triumph. The king of the north will rise again, a multitude larger than the first. And after some years, they will advance with a great army and many supplies. And so if you look in the study guide, the notes here that summarize the actual history of what occurred, Antiochus III and Ptolemy the fourth. So like the prophecy said, the sons will carry these things on. So now we're several generations into the rule of these people. We're about, I think, 100 years or so, maybe 120 years after these kingdoms were established before we get to these situations. Antiochus III, Ptolemy IV would fight at Gaza in 217 BC. Antiochus, as the prophecy said, would come with many people. At this battle, Antiochus showed up with 60,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 103 war elephants. And he still lost. And so then, after Ptolemy IV died, Antiochus III invaded Egypt again. He was successful this time, but then Scopas, one of the generals of the Ptolemies, raised an even greater army, and he was able to push them out of Egypt, and they went all the way through Judea, and they again, this is where Jerusalem changes hands several times. We only noted when it really stuck. This is one of those times it changed. He pushed them all the way back to Lebanon, but then Antiochus defeats them near the headwaters of the Jordan River, and history records that many of the Jews helped supply Ptolemy's army when they were pressing north. Now this becomes important because the Jews had sided with the rulers in Egypt. Now, if you side with the rulers in Egypt, that goes well when who wins? The rulers in Egypt. But what happens when the other side wins? Now you've sided with the losers. And so here are the Jews between the king of the north and the king of the south, and history records that they had sided with the king of the south, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the rulers of the north, when they get in charge of Jerusalem, they are going to make them pay. All right, so verse 14, in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. Violent ones from among your own people will assert themselves to fulfill the vision, but they will fail. Then the king of the north will come, build a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. The forces of the south will not stand. Even their select troops will not be able to resist. The king of the north who comes against him will do whatever he wants, and no one can oppose him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land with total destruction in his hand. He will resolve to come with the force of his whole kingdom, and will reach an agreement with him. He will give his daughter in marriage to destroy it, but she will not stand with him or support him. All right, so again, the battle from the north to the south, history tells us that one of the things Antiochus, the ruler from the north, did to win favor with the Egyptians was an alliance of marriage with Cleopatra the First. But she was, as the prophecy said, she was loyal to her husband, not to her father. Of course, you note that famous name there, Cleopatra. And so the first Cleopatra came from the north, but married into that family of the south, and what becomes one of the most famous names in history with the Egyptians of this period. It's Cleopatra, right? Of course, it's not just because of this lady. There actually were 7 Cleopatras in all. These people like to name, each generation of the family, they always like to name somebody one of those things. This Cleopatra the Seventh is the one who you know with the Romans and Mark Antony, and they'll show up. They'll show up in this prophecy later again. All right, so again, I just point this out. Not so much that the details of all of this is important, but the details of this were given, and basically what you have here is this divine scorecard to know what was going to happen. Now, like so many prophecies, it is more obvious in hindsight. Of course, we living 2,000 years after the fact, we only get hindsight. But these things were told, and we know when these women show up in this history, it's exactly when Daniel foretold that they would show up. And so after the marriage didn't work out, it said he will turn his attention to the coast and the islands and capture many. But a commander will put an end to his taunting. Instead, he will turn his taunts against him. He will turn his attention back to the fortresses of his own land. He will stumble and fall and be no more. And so, as you note there in the study guide, verse 18, the notes, Antiochus III gets into a fight eventually with the Romans. He loses so badly to the Romans under their general, whose name is Publius Scipico, that he has to pay a high tribute, including his own sons as hostages. And then he stopped going after Egypt after this, and because the Egyptians brought in the Romans to help protect them, which it's never a good idea to invite the Romans to be neighborhood protection, because after a little while, what happens? It's all a Roman neighborhood. And so, but that's how the Romans got introduced. And he was killed in Babylon in 187 on the far other side of his kingdom. Antiochus III, he was one of the great rulers of that northern kingdom. He is succeeded by his son Seleucus the fourth, known as Philopator. And then he has to pay a huge tribute to the Romans. As part of that, he taxes the Jews heavily, which starts to. So we're one of the things that we'll see in the history is the Jews start to get more and more disgruntled with all of these things happening. As the fighting keeps going through their territory, they get punished when they side with the ones who lose, and you never know who's going to win. They get taxed heavily to help pay for all of these things, and it just starts building up resentments more and more of the Jews. All right, so. Anyway, that guy, Seleucus the Fourth, he was poisoned by one of his ministers, and then his infant son was made king because, again, he died so early on in life that he leaves a very young son to be king. Now, at this point, we stopped having this. We just had a 150-year swath of history from basically verse 4 down to verse 20. So 16 verses, 150 years of political history of this kind of complicated period. And I'm sure if you read these things, you'll say, well, Daniel did a better job of summarizing this than you did. And I'll go, yeah, he sure did. The divine brevity that you see all through the scriptures is an amazing thing. But now it's going to talk about in some detail this son of Philopator, this Antiochus the Fourth. So the grandson of the great Antiochus the Third, this Antiochus the Fourth is going to be here, and we're going to have a longer description of him and his activities, in large part because this is one of these despicable, the notorious character. He is going to be called, depending on your translation, but some translations will describe him as the despicable person. So that's probably not a divine description you want, right? Well, who's he? He's the despicable person. And so Antiochus IV is one of the terrible, terrible rulers that we find. He is like Herod level bad. This is the guy whose terrible things will be it'll provoke a revolt. That's how bad this man is. He is going to provoke the Maccabean revolt. Okay, so again, I'm sure those details of history were eminently fascinating to you, and you might want to discuss the geopolitical implications of a number of those. And if you do, this would be the time for questions or comments. No, probably not. But again, what is the lesson we can learn from this kind of detailed prophecy?
It shows there in 2 Timothy 3, it says every scripture is inspired of God. We're able to lay the whole plan out, and we can see where these things that were talked about, prophesied, that they did come to pass, that they were factual. This shows and gives proof that God's word is a special divine revelation. It is inspired by him. It is not something that is made up. No man can have that much foresight. People say Nostradamus is a prophet.
Right.
He no way comes close to what has ever been prophesied, whether the book of Daniel, or whether he believed in some of the other minor prophets. no one ever comes close. It just shows that God, we're his special walk. So to me it is, why not trust that, put your trust in that, instead of some of these other things that fail miserably in comparison to God's word.
Yeah, that's true. What you have here is this 150 or 60 year summary of history. You can just lay out real people in real places in real times, and when a direction is given, a north and a south, or a daughter or a son, a relationship is given, you can actually match these up. You can match these things up on a calendar and a map and a historical timeline. So calendars, maps, and historical timelines work out with these in unbelievable detail. And now, again, as we've mentioned before, if you take the dispensational view of, say, the book of Revelation, or some of the sections of Daniel and the like as being future history, what would you want to do? You'd want to break out the modern political map, the recent political actions, and what if you could start matching some of those up into these prophecies which you think are beginning to be fulfilled right now? You go, I can lock the first 4 or 5 teeth of these gears together, and if I can lock what happens if I have 2 gears and I can lock the first couple of teeth of them together? What's going to happen the farther you turn? They're just going to keep matching up more and more and more, and then you get to a section of prophecy where you say, this is the end of the world, or this is the rapture, or this is the whatever, and what do you say? We're about 5 clicks away, right? We're about 5 events away from these things coming. And so, like I say, the study of this has really given me more and more sympathy for the people who attempt those things with the trust that God has told our future with the same kind of detail that God has told these people's future. Now, I'm not dispensational. I don't believe that is what those prophecies of the book of Revelation are about or the like, or Daniel having some future components to it. But if you take that framework, you can see why people would be really wanting to do that.
Do you know, this chapter 11 really seems to fit so tightly with historical events.
Yes.
Do our premillennial friends try and say chapter 11 is?
Not so much 11. 9 and a little bit of 12.
Okay.
This is, I don't know of any other place of a historical prophecy where like I say, the timeline, the calendar, and the map just keep meshing. There are certainly Psalms, where, like Psalm 22. If you read Psalm 22 and then you go read the crucifixion accounts in the Gospels, you see the same kind of locking up, right? And actually, Psalm 22 is quoted a number of times in the Gospels. And so there's a few things like that. Or you can put together enough Psalms to see, you can nearly tell you can tell most of the Gospel story out of the Psalms, right? But you need a bunch of Psalms. Psalm 22, maybe Psalm 69, pieces of it. There are places where you have this kind of prophetic thing. But for history, I don't know of any. Again, you go through Isaiah and you'll find pieces of Cyrus, like maybe even half a chapter about Cyrus, 300-400 years in the future. Or you'll find a little bit about the end of cities like Tyre. Isaiah speaks about it. And so there's pieces of Old Testament prophecy that will click right into a map and a timeline. But I don't know of any other place like this where it is just one after the other. It's like climbing a ladder of history. It's like telling the history through something that was said 150 years ago. So this and Psalm 22 to me are kind of unique in that aspect. All right, so now we come to the one who really, all of this history was important to the Jews, but now we're going to have a thing that really is important in the moral history of the people, in the religious history of the people. I've mentioned that this next section and the events of it. The Jews still remember it with the Feast of Hanukkah, because there are 2 feasts that the Jews observe today which are not of those feasts that God gave to Moses, right? And so when the Jews keep the Passover, what does that go back to? The delivery out of Egypt, the keeping of the Pentecost, the Feast of Booths. Where do those go back to? Moses delivering them in the wilderness. But the Jews keep two feasts today with great regularity and dedication that you read about, or you see them and you go, well, where is that in the Old Testament? And one of them, like we do find in the Old Testament, at the end of the book of Esther, the Jews start keeping the Feast of Purim, right? And that's kind of a minor holiday, but it's a holiday observed nonetheless. And so that feast is not from Moses, but it's from the time of Esther. And then we have the other big feast that we see today, the Feast of Hanukkah. And where do you read about that at all in your Old Testament? You don't. It comes here. You do read about Hanukkah by another name in the New Testament. You read about Hanukkah as the feast of anybody? What'd you say, Donna? It's called the Feast of Lights. It's in the New Testament. It's called the Feast of Dedication, and it's about them dedicating the temple after getting rid of all of the pollution and corruption and idolatry that this Antiochus brought in. Now, I see our time is gone, so I'll just give you this as a preview. In the Old Testament system, at the temple, especially before the time of captivity, was there idolatry in God's temple? Yes, Matt just said. There was idolatry in God's temple. And who brought in the idols? The kings of Judah. Who set up idols in God's temple in the Old Testament? The kings of Judah. And did that get objected to? Yeah, but the prophets didn't like it much. But what did the people think? Hey, we like that new stuff. Something new and shiny. In this occasion, we're going to have idolatry brought into the temple again. But it's not going to be by the Jews. It's going to be forced upon the Jews by a person who is called the despised one in this translation, the despicable one in other translations. It's a despised and despicable person who forces idolatry into the temple. And how do the Jews feel about it? They hate it so much they cause a civil war. And so that's a difference, isn't it? That's a difference. One of the things we might consider, and we will in future lessons, is what is this difference now of the Old Testament Jews, here these intertestament Jews, and eventually New Testament Jews. Can you imagine if somebody in Jesus' time would have tried to set up an idol in the temple? What would the Jews have done? They would have rioted. What gets Paul arrested in Acts 21? It's claimed that he brought a Gentile into the temple. Well, here in this prophecy of Antiochus, we're going to see the last Gentile who really interposes onto the temple. And he sets up idolatry in the temple, and he causes a civil war over it. And so something is happening in the character of Jewish religion that is a great change from the time before the captivity, isn't it? It's really a big change. Well, in future lessons, we'll talk about what that is. Just spoiler, I think it's very much tied to the synagogues. It's tied to that weekly reading of the Scripture. Now, does that mean they got everything right? No. Read the Gospels. But is that a great improvement over the situation before? Say the time of Manasseh or somebody else. Oh, it's a big improvement. All right, so that's our lesson. Next time we'll take it up, that prophecy in verse 21. We'll take it up with Antiochus and the provoking things he does to the Jews.